It was the kind of evening I had dreamed about for weeks, my 8th wedding anniversary with Jonathan. Our home glowed with the warm light of candles, their flickering reflections dancing off the crystal glasses set neatly on the dining table. White lilies, my favorite, were arranged in tall vases around the room, filling the air with a sweet, clean scent. A soft string quartet played in the background, the gentle notes weaving seamlessly into the low hum of conversation and laughter from our closest friends and family. Every detail had been chosen with care, the champagne chilling in silver buckets, the delicate desserts laid out like artwork, the golden fairy lights strung across the garden outside. I moved through the crowd with a full heart, greeting guests, making sure everyone felt welcome, and occasionally catching Jonathan's eyes across the room. He looked at me the way he had on our wedding day, like I was the only woman in the world. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Jonathan was the perfect host that night. He greeted every guest warmly, refilled glasses before they were empty, and made a point to introduce people who hadn't met before. I could feel the pride in his touch when he slid his arm around my waist and pulled me close, the scent of his cologne wrapping around me like a familiar embrace. When his best man from our wedding called out for a speech, Jonathan didn't hesitate. He raised his glass and smiled, his voice steady and affectionate as he spoke. 8 years ago, I married my best friend, my anchor, my everything. Isabella, you've made my life brighter in every way. Here's to 8 more years and many more after that. The guests erupted into applause, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. This was love, I thought. This was safety. That's when Clara arrived, fashionably late as always, wearing a soft blue dress that complemented her warm complexion. I had known Clara since our college days. She had been my rock during my first heartbreak, my partner in crime on late-night adventures, my maid of honor. In her arms, she carried little Sophie, her 3-year-old daughter with round cheeks and big curious eyes. I had heard countless stories about Sophie's absent father, the man who had walked away before she was even born, and my heart always ached for the little girl. Tonight, Sophie clung shyly to Clara's shoulder, burying her face when I greeted her, before peeking out with a hesitant smile. I laughed softly, telling Clara she could put Sophie down in the guest room if she got tired later. We'd done this before. Sophie was always welcome here, and I was always happy to help. At that moment, I believed without question that I was surrounded by nothing but love, loyalty, and the kind of friendships that lasted a lifetime. The night had been everything I'd hoped for, full of warmth, laughter, and the kind of moments you file away in the vault of forever memories. Guests had eaten their fill, conversations had mellowed into soft chatter, and the music had dropped to a lazy hum in the background. I was in the kitchen, wrapping up slices of the anniversary cake for guests to take home, my emerald green dress sweeping the polished floor as I moved. The scent of vanilla frosting lingered in the air, mixing with the faint perfume of lilies drifting in from the dining room. Jonathan's voice carried from the other side of the house, still deep and steady as he talked to our friends. I hummed quietly, feeling content in the kind of way that makes you believe life really is as perfect as it seems. I had just sealed another cake box when I heard a small, high-pitched cry from upstairs, the unmistakable sound of a child waking somewhere between confused and upset. I smiled to myself. Sophie, poor thing, probably woke up disoriented, wondering where she was. Before I could set the box down and head toward the stairs, Jonathan's voice called out, "I'll check on her." I pictured him walking up to soothe her, maybe carrying her back down so Clara could gather her things and head home. My husband was good with kids. He always had been. It was one of the reasons I was so certain he'd make an amazing father someday. Footsteps echoed on the staircase a few minutes later, Jonathan's heavier tread paired with the lighter, rapid patter of little feet. I smiled as I stepped out from the kitchen into the hallway that led to the dining room, ready to say goodbye to Clara and Sophie. My heart was still light, my mind still wrapped in the glow of the evening. I was halfway through, forming the words, "Did she wake up cranky?" when Sophie's tiny voice rang out, clear and sharp enough to slice through the air. "Daddy, can we go home now?" The word hit me like a physical blow. Daddy. Not Uncle Jonathan. Not Mama's friend. Daddy. In the span of a heartbeat, everything in the room seemed to shift. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were lowered. Chairs stilled. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward the little girl, now reaching up with complete familiarity toward Jonathan, her small arms wrapping easily around his neck, as though she had done it 1,000 times before. I froze in place, the blood draining from my face. My fingers went slack around the stem of my champagne glass. It slipped from my grasp in slow motion, the delicate crystal shattering against the marble floor at my feet. Shards scattered like tiny mirrors, each reflecting a jagged piece of the life I thought I knew. Jonathan's face drained of color instantly, his expression a strange mixture of shock and fear. Clara, standing just a step behind him, went pale as though she'd been carved from stone. Sophie nestled comfortably against Jonathan's shoulder, oblivious to the suffocating silence that had fallen over the room. The sound in my ears was deafening, a rushing roar that drowned out everything else. My chest felt tight, my breath caught somewhere between my ribs and my throat. I did the math without even meaning to. Sophie was 3 years old. Jonathan and I had been trying and failing to have a baby for the last 2 years. 3 years old meant she was conceived 4 years ago. 4 years ago, when Jonathan had been distant, moody, and so quick to leave the house for late nights at work. Or grabbing a drink with friends. 4 years ago, during what he had called his quarter-life crisis. 4 years ago, when Clara had just moved back into town and was leaning heavily on me for help, her belly growing bigger while she swore the father was long gone. Oh, I didn't remember walking closer to them, but suddenly I was there, close enough to see the flicker of panic in Jonathan's brown eyes, close enough to watch Clara's hand twitch like she was ready to reach for him. "Get out," I heard myself say, my voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the suffocating air. "Isabella!" Jonathan started, taking a step toward me. "Get out!" The words tore from my throat this time, my voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. I didn't care who heard, didn't care that my guests were still there, watching like stunned spectators to a play that had suddenly turned violent. My vision blurred, but my voice was steady, every syllable trembling with fury. "All of you, get out of my house. Now." The room stirred into uneasy motion, chairs scraped back. Conversations began in hushed, hurried tones. People avoided my eyes as they filed toward the front door, glancing over their shoulders as though afraid they might be next in my line of fire. Jonathan's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for the right words. But none came. Clara took hold of his arm, her fingers curling tightly into his sleeve. "We should go," she murmured, her voice hoarse and urgent. Her eyes darted to mine for the briefest second before dropping to the floor. My younger sister, Evelyn, took a tentative step toward me, her eyes wide with worry. I held up a hand to stop her without looking away from the 2 people standing in front of me. "Not you," I said to Evelyn. "Everyone else. Out." It was over in minutes. Jonathan and Clara moved toward the door, Sophie still perched on his hip, her head resting against his shoulder like it was the most natural place in the world. I couldn't take my eyes off them, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't believe the image in front of me was real. My husband. My best friend. And the child that should have been mine. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The house, once alive with laughter and music, felt instantly hollow, stripped of its warmth, and filled instead with the cold, sharp echo of truth. I stood in the middle of the dining room, the shattered remains of my champagne glass glittering at my feet like tiny pieces of a broken promise. Evelyn came to stand beside me, her hand brushing my arm, but I couldn't move. My body felt like stone, my mind reeling with every detail that suddenly made too much sense. The missed dinners, the vague excuses, the times Jonathan had canceled plans because Clara needed help with something. Every time I'd believed him without question, proud to have such a kind, dependable husband, never realizing he was playing house with her behind my back. "Izzy," Evelyn said softly, using the nickname only family called me. "Do you want me to—" "No," I interrupted, my voice low but steady now. "You've seen enough. That's all I need from you." She hesitated but nodded, understanding that her presence now was as much about being a witness as it was about offering comfort. I bent slowly, carefully gathering the larger pieces of glass into my hand. The sharp edges bit into my skin, but I barely felt it. Pain seemed far away, blurred and irrelevant compared to the crushing weight in my chest. My mind was already turning over the facts, fitting the pieces together like a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. They thought they could keep this secret forever. They thought they could play happy family right in front of me while I played the loyal wife and supportive friend. But they'd made one fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated me. I dropped the shards into the trash and wiped my hands on a napkin, the faint sting in my palm grounding me in the moment. The image of Sophie reaching for Jonathan, her voice calling him Daddy, was seared into my mind. It would never leave me. And maybe that was a good thing. It would remind me, every single day from here on out, that the life I thought I had was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. I turned to Evelyn, my voice calm now, almost too calm. "Lock the door," I told her. "We're done entertaining guests tonight." As the lock clicked into place, I knew with absolute certainty that the woman I had been when this evening started was gone. The new version of me, the one who had just watched her marriage implode in front of 20 witnesses, wasn't going to cry herself to sleep and hope for things to get better. She was going to make sure Jonathan and Clara paid for every single second of the happiness they'd stolen from me. And I was going to start now. The house felt alien once the last car's headlights disappeared down the street. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed what had just happened, and now stood cold and complicit in the truth. The faint smell of champagne lingered in the air, mingling with the sweet, heavy scent of lilies that earlier had felt romantic but now made me nauseous. I stood in the middle of the dining room, the broken glass from my fallen flute swept into a corner, the once perfect table littered with half-empty glasses and crumpled napkins. The music had stopped hours ago. But in my head, there was still a deafening noise. A chaotic replay of Sophie's voice calling Jonathan Daddy over and over again. Each repetition was another fissure cracking through the foundation of my marriage. Evelyn had tried to get me to sit down, maybe drink some water, but I waved her off. I didn't want comfort. I didn't even want company. I wanted silence, the kind that lets you hear your own thoughts clearly, no matter how much you wish you couldn't. Eventually, she hugged me tightly, whispered that she was just a phone call away, and slipped out the door. When I was finally alone, the truth began to creep in like a slow, invasive fog. My mind drifted backward without my permission, pulling me into the timeline I had avoided examining for years. Sophie was 3. Jonathan and I had been trying for a baby for 2 of those years with no success. That meant Sophie had been conceived a full year before our attempts began. 4 years ago, Jonathan had changed. It was subtle at first. More nights spent at the office. Sudden weekend trips to scout sites for his architectural projects. A restlessness in his eyes when we were together. Back then, he had called it his quarter-life crisis, laughing like it was just a quirky phase. He'd told me he needed space to figure himself out. And I, ever the trusting wife, had given it to him. I thought I was being supportive. In reality, I was giving him room to betray me. And Clara. She had shown up around the same time, freshly back in town after a bad breakup, looking for support. I had been so happy to have my best friend close again. I'd brought her soup when she was sick, helped her apartment hunt, even been there when she announced she was pregnant. She told me the father had bolted, that she didn't even want him involved. I'd believed her without hesitation. God, I had even thrown her a baby shower. Now every memory was tainted, every detail reframed under the harsh light of the truth. The late nights, the unexplained absences. The way Jonathan's face would light up whenever Sophie toddled into the room, even before she could talk. I used to think it was because he loved kids and couldn't wait to be a dad. Now I knew better. I moved through the silent house like an intruder in my own life, each step heavier than the last. The living room, once warm and inviting, felt staged photos of Jonathan and me on vacations, framed dinner party shots with Clara smiling in the background, Sophie on my lap during her 2nd birthday party. I stopped in front of that one. My hand shook as I touched the glass. Jonathan's arm was draped over the back of my chair, his gaze not on me but on Sophie. Something hot and sharp flared in my chest. I headed upstairs, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet of our bedroom. It looked exactly as it had that morning, our wedding photo on his nightstand, the bed neatly made, his clothes hanging in the closet by color and season. On the surface, everything was perfect. But perfection was just a mask, and I was ready to rip it off. I opened his nightstand drawer, half expecting to find nothing but receipts and stray coins. Instead, tucked beneath an old paperback, I found a small velvet box. My pulse hammered in my ears as I lifted it out. It was the kind of box meant for jewelry, gifts of love, tokens of sentiment. I opened it slowly, my breath catching when I saw what was inside. A delicate silver bracelet, sized for a child, with a tiny heart-shaped charm. It wasn't mine. It could never have been mine. It was Sophie's. There was a folded receipt in the box. I unfolded it with trembling fingers and read the date. 3 months ago. The same week, Jonathan had told me he was working late on a big project. I remembered that week vividly because I had made dinner reservations for us at our favorite restaurant, and he'd canceled at the last minute. Said he couldn't afford to take time away from work because business was slow and we had to watch our finances. I'd nodded, understanding, supportive. Meanwhile, he'd been buying jewelry for his daughter with another woman. My knees gave way, and I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the bracelet dangling from my fingers. The charm spun slowly, catching the light in soft flashes, as if mocking me. I'd been dreaming about the children Jonathan and I might have one day, planning their names, imagining their faces while he'd been living that dream with someone else right under my nose. The tears came fast and unrelenting, hot streams down my cheeks that blurred my vision. I cried for the marriage I thought I had, for the friend I thought I could trust, for the years I'd wasted loving someone who saw me as nothing more than a cover story. But somewhere beneath the grief, something else was forming, something cold and focused. I started replaying every moment, every conversation I'd ever had with Jonathan and Clara. The times Clara had called me in tears, saying she felt so alone. The times Jonathan had canceled plans to help Clara with something. The trips to the grocery store where I'd filled a cart with food for her, thinking I was helping a struggling single mother. I had been their accomplice without even knowing it. The humiliation burned deeper than the betrayal. How many people knew? Had our friends suspected? Were they all laughing behind my back, pitying me while I smiled and played hostess at dinners where my husband's mistress sat across the table? I stood abruptly and crossed the room to his side of the closet. I pulled open drawers, rifled through suit pockets, searching for anything else, any scrap of evidence that would confirm the depth of his lies. Bank receipts, notes, hotel keycards. I found enough to make my stomach churn. Charges at toy stores, children's clothing boutiques, amusement parks, all spread neatly across the last 3 years, like some twisted ledger of his double life. I carried the receipts to my desk in the home office, laying them out in a grim timeline. Each charge coincided with a milestone in Sophie's life: birthday parties, Christmas, her first day at daycare. My eyes froze on a recurring monthly payment labeled Sunshine Academy. I'd seen it on our statements before and assumed it was for a community charity Jonathan donated to through his firm. I never questioned it. Now, the pattern was glaring. He'd been supporting them financially, emotionally, using money from our joint account, the one my salary contributed to as much as his. He had stolen from me to fund his secret family. The pain in my chest hardened into something else: resolve. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers tracing the edge of Sophie's bracelet. I had been blind, yes, but I wasn't going to stay that way. If Jonathan thought I would just crumble, sign the papers quietly, and fade into the background while he played happy family with Clara, he was sorely mistaken. I wasn't going to confront them tonight, not yet. Confrontation would give them a chance to lie, to spin the story in their favor. No, I needed proof, the kind that couldn't be denied or explained away, the kind that could destroy both of them in every circle they moved in. I placed the bracelet back in its box, not out of sentiment, but because I knew I'd need it later. It was a piece of the puzzle, and soon I'd have the whole picture. As I turned off the light and headed back downstairs, I realized something. The woman who had started this day, the one in the emerald dress, glowing with love and pride, was gone. In her place was someone sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Jonathan had spent 4 years lying to me, and Clara had spent just as long smiling in my face while she raised his child. They had used my trust as a weapon against me. But now I had something far more powerful than trust. I had clarity. And clarity I thought as I closed the bedroom door behind me, was going to be the sharpest blade I'd ever wield. The morning after the anniversary party felt like waking up in a different life. The sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows seemed sharper, almost intrusive, exposing every shadowed corner where lies had once lived unnoticed. I didn't linger over coffee, didn't bother trying to eat. My mind was too busy, whirring like a machine that had just been switched into overdrive. The grief was still there, an ache lodged deep in my chest, but it had been joined by something far more potent. Focus. If Jonathan and Clara thought the worst I would do was cry and lick my wounds, they were about to learn how wrong they were. This wasn't going to be a quiet divorce. This was going to be a dismantling, brick by brick, of the lives they'd so smugly built on my back. The first step was calling Martha Lewis. I'd known her for years. She had handled the purchase of our house and drawn up our wills. In her early 50s, Martha was the kind of lawyer people described as unshakable. Her voice alone carried a weight that made you want to straighten your spine and tell the truth. I dialed her number just after 7 a.m., knowing she'd be at her desk with her first cup of coffee by then. "Martha, it's Isabella Morgan. I need to see you today. Urgently." There was a pause long enough for her to register that I wasn't making small talk before she answered. 9 o'clock. My office. Bring everything. Everything. The word echoed in my head as I gathered the evidence I already had. The velvet box with Sophie's bracelet and receipt, the folder of bank statements from the night before, the printouts of suspicious charges, and recurring payments to Sunshine Academy. I didn't bother to shower. I wanted the rawness of last night to still be visible when I sat in front of her, to leave no room for her to think this was anything less than catastrophic. Her office was a space designed to intimidate dark wood shelves lined with heavy law books, a massive oak desk, leather chairs that swallowed you whole. She took one look at my face and poured me coffee without a word. "Tell me," she said, pen poised over a legal pad. I laid it all out, from the perfect party to Sophie's fateful daddy, to the years of subtle betrayals I'd only now connected. I slid the bracelet box across the desk, then the bank statements, then the receipts. Her pen scratched steadily as she wrote, her expression giving nothing away. When I finished, I took a deep breath. "I want a divorce, Martha, and I want him to walk away with nothing but his clothes, not a penny more than the law requires." She nodded slowly. "Then our first priority is gathering irrefutable proof. The affair is one thing, but if we can connect him financially to the child and prove he used marital funds to support them, we'll have leverage. You've already got to start here." She tapped the receipts. "But we'll need more." "What about paternity?" I asked. "DNA test," she replied. "Best if it's court-ordered. That way, no one can challenge the chain of custody. If Sophie is his, and he's been avoiding child support, that's fraud. That's jail time, and in a divorce, that gives you an edge." The thought of him in jail didn't make me flinch. "How do we make that happen?" "I'll file for divorce immediately and request a paternity test as part of the proceedings. In the meantime, you keep collecting evidence. Bank accounts, credit cards, calendars, travel logs, anything that ties him to Clara and Sophie." I left her office feeling steadier than I had in days. The plan was already taking shape, and I was going to follow it to the letter. Back home, I cleared the dining table and laid out a fresh legal pad. At the top of the page, I wrote Operation Justice. Underneath, I drew 2 columns: targets and tactics. The first list was easy. Targets: Jonathan's current clients, his business partner David Chen, Clara's employer, Family Futures Foundation, our shared social circle, mutual acquaintances from college, Jonathan's extended family, especially those who prided themselves on their good name. The second list was more strategic. Tactics: anonymous tips to his clients about his unethical behavior, formal complaints to the Child Support Enforcement Agency, subtle but pointed conversations with Clara's colleagues, strategic confidences shared at social gatherings to ensure the truth spread in the right ears, leaks of documented proof to people who would never be able to keep it to themselves. Once the framework was there, I moved on to the evidence hunt. The first stop was Jonathan's home office. He'd always been careful, but careful people get sloppy when they think no one's watching. I sifted through folders labeled with project names, invoices, and architectural blueprints. In the back of the bottom drawer, I found a thin manila envelope stuffed with travel receipts, hotel stays in nearby cities that coincided perfectly with Clara's weekend getaways when she'd claimed Sophie was with her parents. Next, I moved to his laptop. The password hadn't changed, which was almost insulting. Within minutes, I had access to his email, calendar, and client files. His calendar was a goldmine. Meetings that didn't exist, site visits that matched the dates of those hotel stays, entire afternoons blocked off as personal time that lined up perfectly with charges at toy stores and children's boutiques. I printed everything, labeling each sheet with the date and the suspicious activity. The bank accounts were even worse. Scrolling through our joint statement, I started flagging every expense that couldn't possibly have been for me. The boutique children's clothing store Clara loved, the upscale toy shop downtown, payments to Sunshine Academy disguised as SA Consulting. It wasn't just the big purchases, it was the pattern. Every month, without fail, money had been siphoned from our life into theirs. By the time I was done, I had a stack of evidence thick enough to fill a binder. I slid it all into a large black portfolio and locked it in my own office, where Jonathan no longer had access. With the financial trail secured, I turned my attention to the people. I started a separate list of Jonathan's active clients, noting which ones valued their company's image above all else. I didn't need to lie to them. The truth was enough to make them reconsider working with him. All I had to do was present it in a way that made them feel complicit if they stayed silent. For Clara, the strategy was different. Her entire job rested on maintaining the wholesome image of her nonprofit. A scandal involving an affair with a married man, especially one who was neglecting to support his own child publicly, would be devastating. I made a note to reach out to a board member I'd met at a gala last year, someone who had seemed particularly fond of me and critical of immorality. Finally, there was our social circle. Gossip was a currency in that world, and I intended to flood the market. The key was to avoid appearing vindictive. I would position myself as the wronged wife reluctantly telling the truth so no one could be manipulated by their lies. The result would be the same: isolation for both of them. By late afternoon, the table was covered in neatly labeled folders, color-coded by category: financial, travel, clients, Clara, social network. Looking at them, I felt a surge of control. This wasn't about screaming matches or tearful confrontations. This was about precision. Every move I made from here on out would be deliberate, calculated to hit them where it hurt most. Jonathan thought he could divide his life into two halves, me in one, Clara and Sophie in the other, and keep them from ever colliding. Now, I was going to make sure those worlds crashed into each other so violently that neither would survive intact. I sat back in my chair, the pen still warm in my hand, and glanced at the clock. Martha's filing for divorce would already be in motion. The paternity test request would follow. Soon there'd be official paperwork Jonathan couldn't ignore, and the walls he'd built around his double life would start closing in. For the first time since Sophie's voice had split my world in two, I felt almost calm. This was no longer just about betrayal. It was about justice on my terms. And I was going to see it through to the very end. The first strike had to be clean, deliberate, and impossible to trace back to me. Martha had drilled that into my head during our last meeting. This wasn't about reckless revenge. This was about constructing a case so airtight that even the smallest crack could not be exploited. Still, that didn't mean I couldn't enjoy watching the first domino fall. Jonathan's largest client was Kingswell Development, a real estate investment firm that prided itself on ethical partnerships. Their CEO, Leonard Briggs, was an old-school businessman with a reputation for cutting ties. The moment even a whiff of scandal threatened his projects. I knew this because I'd sat across from him at countless corporate dinners, listening to him boast about his company's family-first image. If Leonard got wind of Jonathan's extracurricular activities and the fact that company resources might have been funneled into a mistress and secret child, Jonathan's career would shatter faster than the champagne flute. I dropped that night. I started with an anonymous email, sent from a freshly created account with no ties to me. The subject line was simple: urgent. Potential misuse of company resources. Confidential. The body was more meticulous. I laid out the timeline of Jonathan's trips, the hotel receipts paid for under client project codes, the boutique purchases run through the corporate card. I didn't accuse outright. I simply attached copies of the receipts and suggested Leonard might want to verify whether these expenses aligned with approved business activities. I closed the email with a single line. As a longtime admirer of Kingswell Development's integrity, I thought you'd want to be aware. By the time I hit send, my heart was pounding not with fear, but with anticipation. Jonathan had no idea this email existed, and Leonard was the type to act first and ask questions later. The second target was far less subtle. The Child Support Enforcement Agency wasn't interested in preserving anyone's image. They were interested in facts, money, and legal compliance. I picked up the phone and called their downtown office, my voice calm and measured as I introduced myself. "I'm calling to file a report on a case of unpaid child support," I said, letting the words hang for just a second before continuing. "The father in question has been avoiding financial responsibility for over 3 years, despite having full knowledge of the child's existence." The woman on the line asked for names, dates, and documentation. I gave her Jonathan's full name, date of birth, employer, and the address he shared with me, still legally his residence. Then I outlined the suspected paternity, the ongoing relationship with the child's mother, and the suspicious payments that had been labeled as consulting or personal expenses. When she asked if I had proof, I smiled to myself and told her I would be happy to email over the receipts and bank statements I had collected. "There's also a bracelet," I added, "purchased the same week the father claimed to be working late every night. The receipt is dated and paid for with a joint account." By the end of the call, the agency had opened a formal investigation. They would be requesting a paternity test through the court system and pulling Jonathan's financial records independently. I hung up the phone with the knowledge that this was no longer just a marital dispute, it was now a legal matter with state enforcement behind it. The third strike was the one I savored most. Clara had always painted herself as the embodiment of virtue. She worked at the Family Futures Foundation, a nonprofit that built its reputation on promoting stable, two-parent households and advocating for responsible parenting. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't need to fabricate anything to ruin her here. The truth was damning enough. I waited until late afternoon, when I knew her boss, Elaine Sutton, would be in her office but winding down for the day. I called from a number Clara wouldn't recognize and pitched my voice with a mix of hesitation and quiet concern. "Miss Sutton, my name is Emily Carter. I'm a friend of someone who works for you, Clara Evans. I'm not sure if this is the right thing to do, but I felt you should know about a situation that might reflect poorly on the foundation." Elaine's tone sharpened instantly. "What kind of situation?" I let a small pause hang before I answered. "Clara has been in a long-term relationship with a married man, one who's been using marital funds to support her and her child while avoiding legal child support. I don't know if you're aware, but the Foundation's mission is tied closely to family values, and this could be difficult if it were to become public." Elaine asked for specifics. I gave them. Dates. Receipts. The fact that the man was still living with his wife until very recently. I told her about the hotel stays, the gifts, and the private school payments that were all funded by a joint marital account. I didn't mention Jonathan's name outright, not yet. I simply said, "You'll find it in the receipts I can send you if you'd like." Her silence spoke volumes. The Foundation's public image was everything. The idea that one of their own was entangled in an affair that contradicted their core values was a scandal waiting to erupt. She thanked me for my concern and said she would look into it. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, calculating the damage control she'd have to start immediately. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the first wave of my offensive was already in motion. Leonard had my anonymous email sitting in his inbox, complete with documented evidence that tied Jonathan's professional credibility to personal misconduct. The Child Support Enforcement Agency had an open case number and a growing file on Jonathan Morgan, complete with my labeled exhibits. And Clara's pristine image at the Foundation now had a hairline fracture that, with just the right pressure, would split wide open. I didn't need to be in the room when these revelations hit their targets. I could picture it all. Leonard calling Jonathan into his office, demanding explanations he couldn't give without incriminating himself. The state sending certified letters requiring his appearance in court. Clara walking into work, only to be met with Elaine's cold, probing questions. They had spent years weaving their secret life into something they thought was untouchable. Now, with 3 carefully placed strikes, I had ensured that the threads were starting to unravel, and this was only the beginning. As I locked my files away for the night, a calm, deliberate satisfaction settled over me. Jonathan and Clara thought they had outmaneuvered me. What they didn't realize was that the game they'd been playing all along was mine to win, and I was just getting started. The night of the dinner party was warm, the kind of late spring evening where the air felt thick with the promise of summer. My dining room table was set with precision-polished silverware, crystal glasses, candles flickering low enough to cast flattering light. To anyone walking in, it looked like I was hosting one of my signature gatherings, the kind where friends left with full stomachs and warmer hearts. But beneath the clink of wine glasses and the scent of rosemary roasted chicken, there was a razor edge to the night. This wasn't just a dinner. This was a stage. I'd invited only people who mattered in both Jonathan's and Clara's social or professional spheres, the ones whose opinions had weight, whose whispers could spread like wildfire in the right circles. There was David Chen, Jonathan's business partner, Meredith and Paul, who sat on the Homeowners Association board, Elise and Graham, who were as plugged into the city's social scene as anyone could be, and even 2 board members from the Family Futures Foundation where Clara worked. On paper, this was a casual get-together. In reality, it was a carefully engineered audience. Jonathan arrived late, as I knew he would. Clara trailed behind him, looking uncharacteristically nervous in a dress that was too formal for the occasion. I greeted them with the same calm, polite smile I'd worn for years, the one that concealed far more than it revealed. Dinner began innocently enough: salad, small talk, the usual banter about local events and vacation plans. But I'd planned the seating so that Jonathan and Clara were directly across from me, close enough to see every twitch in their faces when the moment came. Halfway through the main course, I set down my fork and let my voice cut through the gentle hum of conversation. "There's something I need to share," I said, my tone steady, but carrying enough weight to make every head turn toward me. Jonathan's eyes flickered with warning, but I didn't break eye contact. Instead, I reached under the table and pulled out a slim black folder. "I think it's only fair that our friends here know the truth. About you, about Clara, and about Sophie." The silence was instant, thick. I slid the folder across the table to David first. Inside were copies of the receipts, the hotel bookings, the bank statements, every piece of evidence I'd meticulously collected over the past weeks. "You've all seen Jonathan play the part of the devoted husband," I continued, my voice still even. "But for the past 3 years, he's been using our joint finances and in some cases company resources to support a second family with Clara." Meredith gasped. Paul muttered something under his breath, and David's face hardened as he flipped through the pages. I let the evidence make its own noise, the rustle of paper, the click of a pen as someone started taking notes. "This isn't hearsay," I added. "Every charge, every date, every hotel stay lines up. And if you're wondering about Sophie, yes, she's his daughter. And no, he hasn't been paying legal child support. That's now under investigation by the state." Jonathan pushed back his chair, but the room wasn't on his side anymore. "Isabella, this is..." he started, but David cut him off. "This is fraud, John. Against the company, against your clients. Do you realize what this means for Kingswell Development?" Clara's face had drained of all color. One of the foundation board members, Elaine's deputy, looked at her like she'd just spat on their mission statement. "And you," the woman said coldly, "represent an organization built on moral integrity. How do you think this will look in our annual report?" The rest of the dinner was a blur of tension. Jonathan tried to explain, Clara tried to speak over him, but the damage was done. The more they talked, the worse they sounded: defensive, contradictory, and cornered. My friends didn't leave in a rush. They left with slow, deliberate finality, the kind that meant they'd never see Jonathan or Clara the same way again. By morning, the whispers had already turned into shouts. Meredith texted me that people were talking at the country club. David didn't bother hiding his fury. He'd already called an emergency meeting at the firm. Within 48 hours, Jonathan's largest contract, Kingswell Development, was terminated due to ethical concerns. Other clients followed suit. His business account was frozen pending an internal audit. And I knew from the way his voice cracked when he called Martha's office that he understood this wasn't just professional trouble, it was financial ruin. Clara's downfall came just as swiftly. Elaine called me personally to thank me for bringing this to light, and confirmed that Clara had been suspended from her position, pending a full review by the Foundation's Ethics Committee. For someone whose career revolved around polished public image, the public knowledge of her affair with a married man, and the fact that she'd allowed her child to be supported through stolen marital funds, was poison. The social fallout was brutal. Our mutual friends stopped returning Jonathan's calls. Clara was uninvited from charity events. At the grocery store, people whispered behind their hands, some bold enough to stare openly. The same people who had once toasted them at parties now crossed the street to avoid being seen with them. For me, the shift was like breathing different air. I wasn't invisible anymore. People sought me out not to gossip, but to express their shock, their support, their disbelief at how Jonathan and Clara had fooled everyone. The sympathy wasn't my goal, but it was a useful byproduct. It reinforced my position, gave me credibility, and ensured that when the divorce proceedings reached the public stage, I'd already won the court of public opinion. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan's professional reputation collapsed. Kingswell's termination led to a cascade of other contracts being pulled. His accounts, both business and personal, were flagged by the bank after irregularities were reported. Without steady income, his lifestyle shrank rapidly. The man who had once insisted on wearing tailored suits to the grocery store was now scrambling to liquidate assets just to cover legal fees. Clara, meanwhile, was drowning in a different kind of ruin. The Foundation's suspension was only the beginning. Her name was whispered in scandal columns. Her photo taken at some gala last year circulated online, with captions that barely veiled their contempt. Sophie was suddenly a topic of cruel speculation among the parents at her school, and Clara was left to navigate that fallout alone. I didn't gloat publicly. I didn't need to. The truth had done the work for me. All I had to do was keep my hands steady on the wheel as their carefully constructed lives came apart at the seams. Looking back, that dinner was more than just a social gathering. It was a public unmasking, the point of no return. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't thrown anything. I hadn't even raised my voice. I'd simply laid the truth on the table, in front of the people whose opinions could destroy them. And then I'd stepped back, letting society's natural hunger for scandal take over. Jonathan and Clara had once believed they could control the narrative. Now they were just characters in a story that everyone else was telling, and I was the one who had handed out the scripts. The envelope from the State Child Support Enforcement Office arrived on a Thursday morning, stamped with the kind of official seal that makes your stomach twist even before you open it. I didn't have to imagine Jonathan's reaction. I could picture it perfectly, his face tightening, his jaw clenching, his fingers digging into the paper as he read the words that would obliterate the last remnants of his defense. The paternity test results were conclusive: 99% certainty that Jonathan Morgan was the biological father of Sophie Evans. There was no more room for denial, no more clever word games, no more pretending she was someone else's problem. The report was blunt, clinical, and backed by the full force of the state's legal authority. Alongside the DNA confirmation came a formal notice. Jonathan was liable for back child support, calculated for the past 3 years, plus ongoing monthly payments. The total amount due was staggering, well into the hundreds of thousands once penalties and interest were added. Payment was to be arranged immediately, or the state would begin wage garnishment, asset seizure, and potentially jail time for contempt. By mid-afternoon, I knew the news had hit him. Martha called to tell me Jonathan's lawyer had reached out in a near panic, asking if there was any room for negotiation. There wasn't. The numbers were fixed, the order was signed, and the clock was ticking. Every hour he delayed payment was another day closer to the state freezing his accounts. But the financial wrecking ball didn't stop there. Word of the DNA confirmation spread quickly, especially to the business partners who had already been skittish after the earlier revelations. One of them, David Chen, had been combing through their contracts with a fine-toothed comb since the dinner party. Buried in the agreements with their clients were morality clauses, legal triggers that allowed termination if a partner engaged in behavior that damaged the company's reputation. Jonathan's scandal, now publicly tied to financial misconduct and confirmed paternity in an extramarital affair, fit the definition perfectly. David wasted no time. At the next board meeting, the motion was raised to enforce the clause. The vote wasn't even close. Jonathan was told in writing that he was being removed from his role, effective immediately. The letter cited irreparable harm to the company's reputation, loss of client trust, and breach of contractual obligations. The ouster came with another blow, the forced sale of his shares in the firm. Under their agreement, Jonathan couldn't shop his stake to outsiders. He had to sell to the remaining partners at a price determined by an independent valuation. But with the company in damage control mode and his personal brand in flames, the valuation came back insultingly low, a fire sale number that barely covered a fraction of what those shares were worth a year ago. Jonathan had no choice but to accept. He needed the cash. And the cash didn't last long. Between the legal fees for the divorce, the mounting child support debt, and the cost of defending himself against potential fraud charges, Jonathan's bank accounts bled dry. Properties went up for sale, first the vacation condo, then the second car, then finally the family home we'd once shared. Even his watch collection, the one he used to polish before every client meeting, ended up in an online auction. Clara's fall was quieter, but just as final. After the suspension from the Family Futures Foundation, the Ethics Committee's review concluded with unanimous censure. The official statement cited conduct incompatible with the mission and values of the organization. In practical terms, it meant she was blacklisted from similar nonprofits. No family-centered organization would risk hiring someone with her public record. Without a job, Clara's savings evaporated quickly. Whatever support Jonathan had been providing under the table was gone. He could barely keep himself afloat, let alone bankroll her. Within 2 months, she packed her things and moved back into her parents' house. For someone who had spent years cultivating an image of independence and moral authority, it was a humiliating reversal. By summer's end, the pair who had once flaunted their secret life like it was untouchable were reduced to damage control on every front. Jonathan's phone calls to former friends went unanswered. Clara stopped posting on social media altogether. In the rare moments they were seen in public, Jonathan in a rumpled suit at the courthouse, Clara in sweatpants outside a grocery store, their body language told the story. Hunched shoulders, eyes fixed on the ground, the air of people who knew the whispers weren't going away. I didn't need to push further. The state, the corporate world, and their own reputations were doing the work for me. The DNA confirmation hadn't just proved Jonathan's guilt, it had activated a chain of consequences that left no part of their lives untouched. Every bridge they had relied on was either burned or collapsing under them. When I thought back to the night of my anniversary party, the moment Sophie called Jonathan Daddy in front of a room full of witnesses, I realized something that had been the first crack in their armor. Now, months later, the armor wasn't just cracked, it was scattered in pieces so small they could never put it back together. And I hadn't done it with rage or reckless destruction. I'd done it with precision, one piece of truth at a time, until the lies couldn't stand under their own weight. Jonathan once told me that winning in life was all about controlling the narrative. He believed he could spin any situation, that charm and confidence could override facts. But facts have a way of surviving spin. DNA doesn't lie. Bank statements don't lie. Contracts don't lie. And once those facts are in the right hands, there's no controlling the story they write themselves. By the time the final payments were ordered and the last of his shares were sold, Jonathan wasn't just a man who had lost his marriage. He was a man who had lost his career, his assets, and the carefully constructed identity he thought was untouchable. Clara wasn't just a woman who had an affair, she was a woman whose name had become shorthand for hypocrisy in the very circles she once ruled. And me? I was no longer the wife left standing in the shadow of their deceit. I was the architect of their undoing. The one who had made sure the truth wasn't just exposed, but etched into the permanent record legal, financial, and social. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And justice, I had learned, doesn't always come in the form of a courtroom verdict. Sometimes, it comes in the quiet satisfaction of watching the last move play out exactly as you planned it. When the final divorce decree was signed, I walked out of the courthouse with the weight of years lifted from my shoulders. I kept the house, the one I had decorated, maintained, and loved long before Jonathan ever tried to claim it as his domain. Along with it came the majority of our shared assets, thanks to Martha's meticulous legal work and the mountain of evidence I'd built. The court also ordered Jonathan to provide 3 years of spousal support, a buffer that would give me not just financial stability, but the freedom to decide my next move without fear or desperation guiding me. For the first time in years, I woke up in my own bed without feeling like I was bracing for impact. The silence in the mornings wasn't heavy anymore, it was peaceful. I started renovating the guest room into a bright office, with soft light streaming in through sheer curtains and a desk positioned to face the garden. That space became the birthplace of something new. Morgan Consulting, a divorce strategy and recovery firm specifically for women blindsided by betrayal. It began small. Just a few clients, most of them referrals from friends who had heard my story. But soon, word spread. Women came to me not just for legal guidance, but for emotional strategy. I taught them how to gather evidence without tipping off their partners, how to protect their finances, and how to rebuild their identities in the aftermath. I gave them the same tools I had used, along with the reminder that they weren't victims, they were survivors in transition. Some days the work was raw and emotional. I listened to tears, anger, and disbelief. Other days were victories, watching a client walk into court with her head high, knowing she was prepared for whatever came. Each success fueled me, not just because I was helping them, but because every woman who stood her ground felt like another quiet blow against the kind of man Jonathan had been. I didn't shy away from telling my own story when it helped someone feel less alone, but I told it from a place of power, not pain, because that's what I had become: powerful. Not because I'd simply moved on, but because I had made sure those who wronged me faced the real cost of their choices. One crisp autumn evening, I stood in my backyard, watching the last light fade over the garden. The house was quiet. The air smelled faintly of jasmine, and I felt finally like my life belonged entirely to me. My smile wasn't for anyone else's benefit. It was mine. Some people say the best revenge is living well. I disagree. Sometimes, true justice means living well and ensuring that the betrayer pays in full for the life they tried to steal from you. I had done both, and I was just getting started. Looking back, I realize my story isn't just about betrayal, it's about reclaiming power when someone tries to strip it from you. For years, I believed love meant trust without question, sacrifice without limits. That blind loyalty was my biggest mistake. When the truth came out, I had a choice: let it break me or let it build me. I chose the latter. I learned that justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom. It's often the result of quiet, calculated action, driven by self-respect and the refusal to be erased. Walking away isn't weakness. It's the first step toward freedom. And holding people accountable for their actions isn't cruelty, it's balance. I discovered that healing isn't about pretending it didn't happen, but about building something stronger from the ruins, so you'll never be in that position again. If there's one message I'd share, it's this: protect your boundaries, know your worth, and never be afraid to fight for both. Because sometimes, the greatest act of self-love is not just surviving what they did to you, but making sure they never get to do it to anyone else. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.